now, and it all wraps up. Brad's going to wrap it up next week, but we're going to be opening up John chapter 21 today. Let me kind of set it up this way. Sometimes sermons and sermon series are like good volleyball technique: bump, set, spike. Let me explain that. Some sermons are a bump. Okay, they prepare the listener for what's coming next. Glenn's sermon last week was a bump. Okay, some sermons are a set. They set up the congregation for a successful finish. Today's sermon is a set. And next week, next Sunday, Brad is going to spike the entire book of the Gospel of John. And I don't want you to miss it. Next week's passage it's my favorite. It's so good. I'm jealous. I would love to spike this series, but Brad's going to do a great job. I want you to be here for that. And today, I want to kind of set things up for that. As we're going to be looking at the first half of John chapter 21 today, there are 8 characters in today's narrative, 8 people. But the focus is really only on 2 of them: Jesus and the Apostle Peter. And even though you and I can really only identify with one of those 2, I think we could and should learn from both of them. In other words, it's my hope today that we would see how Jesus responds and acts and what he does, and learn a lot from Jesus, some things that are true, some things that are life-giving about this God that we serve. And at the same time, I hope you and I can look at the life of the Apostle Peter and learn from him some things that are true about ourselves. I hope we're willing to go there, because some of the things that we see in the Apostle Peter's life, some of the things that we see in our life are difficult, and they're dark, and they're embarrassing, and they even seem disqualifying. But I hope that we're willing to go there. And if we are willing to go there, then we need to be reminded of what the Apostle Peter's followership of Jesus looked like for the whole 3 years that he followed him. So if we can kind of rewind back to the calling of Peter just for a second. I believe that when Jesus first called Peter to follow him, that what was going through the Apostle Peter's mind was that the Messiah is going to need somebody like Peter on their team. I kind of think that's what was going through Peter's mind. Because if you know anything about Peter, you know he's a hands-on leader, a born leader. People just instinctively follow him. That he's just that kind of a guy, and who wouldn't want that kind of a guy on their team? Peter's top 5 strengths finders were probably achiever, activator, competition, ideation, and spiritual ball hog. Okay, he was just a risk taker, all in, early adopter, probably a high D, an ENTJ. He probably an Enneagram 3 with a wing 8. I don't know anything about that stuff really, but you know, he's the kind of guy that was very capable, natural leader. Who wouldn't want him on the team? He would help any team be successful. Or so he thought. Because as we look at today's text, we find now, 3 years later, that Peter is a different kind of person. That Peter now, after all of his good intentions were not good enough, after fast starts and flat finishes, after overpromising and underdelivering time and time and time again, after denying that he even knew the one person who ever truly loved him, now the Apostle Peter is sick of himself. He's nauseous of his own narcissism, and he actually believes he is disqualified, that he's blown it so badly that he cannot be loved by Christ, let alone used by Jesus Christ. So that's the individual that we're looking at today. That's where the Apostle Peter is today. Listen, here's the truth about Peter that's true about us as well. Our sin is ugly. Our sin is costly. Our sin is damaging, more so than we ever understand. But here's another truth, is that our sins do not disqualify us from being used by God. Let me say that again. Your sin, my sin, does not disqualify us from being used by God. If it did, none of us would be in the ministry game. None of us would be called onto the team. Our sins don't disqualify us from being used by, you know what does disqualify us? Unrepentant hearts, hard hearts. When the Spirit of God convicts us and we say, I don't care. I know right from wrong and I don't care, and we dig our heels in and we have a hard heart, that disqualifies us. That sidelines us. But when there's a soft heart, when there's a willing spirit, when there's the admission of, oh God, I need your grace in fresh ways again, then there's always hope. And that's why chapter 21 is so, so important for us to understand. Because in chapter 21 of the Gospel of John, Jesus reveals, and I use that word on purpose, he reveals some truths about himself that are essential for us to understand. Look at verse number 1. It says this: after this, Jesus revealed himself, there's that word, he revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Now, it would be easy for us to read that and to kind of skip over that, but let me try to unpack how important verse number 1 is to the rest of the chapter, okay? I want to do it this way. So the latest Star Wars movie comes out this Thursday, right? How many of you guys would say you're Star Wars fans? Raise your hands. Nerds, okay? This will be beneficial for you, okay? If you remember how George Lucas always starts the Star Wars films always start with the Star Wars logo shrinking against a backdrop full of stars, right? And then the text appears long ago in the galaxy far, far away. That text is actually called the crawl text. And the purpose of the crawl text, it's really a 2 to 3 paragraph prologue to the film. What it lets us know is, here's what's been going on and here's where we are in the story. So the crawl text gives us context and it sets up the story. Verse number 1 of John chapter 21 is the crawl text for the rest of the chapter. It sets it up and it lets us know, here's where you are, here's what's happening. Is that beneficial for you? Does that make sense? Nerds. Okay. So let's look at it again. Verse number 1. It says, after this, after what? Well, after Jesus appeared to his disciples the first time, post-resurrection, remember they were in the room and Jesus appeared, and they couldn't believe it, and Thomas wasn't there. And then a week later, he appears again for the second time, and Thomas is there, and now Thomas believes. And then after Jesus is absent from them for a few weeks, after all of that, now he reappears. It says, now he reveals himself again to the disciples. And when it says that he revealed himself, the word reveal just simply means that he made himself visible, or he made visible what wasn't apparent earlier. And this goes deeper than just, now you see me, now you don't. Here I am and now I'm gone, that kind of it. It wasn't just that he revealed himself physically. I think what the text is telling us and what the story unfolds is that Jesus is revealing something about how he feels about us and how he relates in our life, how he functions in our life, how he invites us into his world and into his ministry. He's revealing something that doesn't come intuitively to us. Matter of fact, it's very counterintuitive. Matter of fact, as we'll see as this unfolds, it's difficult for us to believe because it seems so unfair and so unfitting. So Jesus reveals himself again to the disciples, and then it says in verse number 1, he revealed himself in this way. So, and that means that this is more than just this is how it went down. It means this is how intentional, how precise Jesus is with the way that he handles us and teaches us. It goes on to verse number 2. And in verse number 2, we see that there are 7 men that are hanging out together. It says Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of the disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. And they said to him, we will go with you. And they got out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So it says that Simon Peter takes the lead. And it's very interesting. I find it fascinating that just about every time in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, every time when it mentions Peter and it puts his surname Simon in front of it, so it's Simon Peter instead of just Peter, when it uses both those names, Simon Peter, it's a red flag. Peter's doing something wrong. He's functioning outside of who he is as a follower of Jesus Christ. It's kind of like when you were growing up and your mom called you by your first and your middle name, right? Greg is not my first name. Greg's my middle name. And when my mom would call me by my first and middle name, I knew, Greg, you're being an idiot, okay? And you're getting called out on it. So this is what's happening. It says Simon Peter tells everybody, he announces that he's going fishing. And I don't think this is a recreational fishing expedition. I think what we're seeing here is that Peter is announcing to the whole crew that he's going back to his former life. He's going back to his former livelihood. I believe Peter felt so disqualified, like he'd blown it so badly that things are beyond repair between him and Jesus. He felt like now he's unqualified, disqualified, unusable, unblessable. He sees no future for himself in the kingdom of God anymore. And when he can't see a way forward, what does he do? He does what all of us do. We tend to go back. He says, I'm going back. He says, I'm going back to my former life, my former livelihood, the things I used to know. Things didn't work out with me hitching my wagon to Jesus. I'm going to have to hitch my wagon to myself. And he says, I'm out. I think this is fascinating. And here's what's true, is that Jesus knew this was going to happen. Jesus knew that Peter was going to do this. Jesus knew that all of his followers were going to do this. Matter of fact, Jesus called it. If you go back a few chapters, when Jesus was doing the upper room discourse in chapter 14 and in John chapter 15 and John chapter 16, after he had shared communion with his followers, had that sweet time, and then Judas leaves the room. He continues communion with his followers and then says, now follow me. And he walks them outside and they go through the vineyard. And he has that portion in John chapter 15 where he says, here's what life with me is like. You're the branches and I'm the vine. You get your life from me. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And he continues to teach them and disclose himself fully. And toward the end of John chapter 16, after he's said everything and taught them everything, and just before he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, he has one last nugget to give them. And here's what he says. He says that the hour is coming when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and you will leave me alone. He said, the hour is coming. He didn't say the day was coming. He knew it was near. He said, the hour is coming when each of you will be scattered to his own home, and you're going to leave me alone. Now, when it says each of you will be scattered to his own home, the word home was actually added by the translators. So Jesus was simply saying, each of you will be scattered to his own. And the deeper meaning is, each of you are going to be scattered not just to your own places and your own possessions and your own businesses and your own affairs and your own life. He says, you're going to go back to depending on yourself and not me. You're going to disconnect yourself and your trust and your faith from me, and you're going to be trusting and relying in your own self. Man, this is what Peter's doing. This is what all of the guys are doing. And listen, this is what we all do. This is so us. Can I be candid just for a minute? There's some of you here that you used to be in the ministry game. Significantly so. But then something happened. Some of you here, you used to disciple people. You used to lead a small group. You used to tithe. You used to serve on a ministry team. You used to visit and care for people. You used to be in the ministry game. And you did significant ministry, and I would even add fruitful ministry, but then something happened. Somebody upset you, and you walked away. Or you upset yourself, and you took yourself out of the game. Or you got frustrated, not just with God's people, not just with God's church, but with God himself, because God didn't act like you think God should act, and you said, I'm out. And it's not God who sidelined you, it's you that sidelined yourself. He never backed up. He never retracted. He never took his arm from around you. You did that yourself. And this is what's happening to the followers of Jesus, to the disciples right now. It's just something that's very human about us, that when we can't figure God out, we pull ourselves out. When we can't see a way forward, when we have disappointed ourselves one time too many, when somebody else has disappointed us one time too many, when God hasn't acted like we think God should act one time too many, we're out. We pull ourselves out. And that's what's happening here. And they go back to their old ways with what's familiar and what they feel like is comfortable and what they think is maybe a little bit more control. What they're trying to do is they're trying to manage their disappointments, because they feel like they just don't fit. They can't take it anymore. And this is so intentional. I think the Lord wants to get us in those places so we're so uncomfortable with ourselves and we don't trust ourselves anymore. We've got to say, oh God, I need your grace. That's where these guys were. And so they say, Peter says, I'm out, and they say, we're with you, and they go fishing. And that night, there's a whole lot of fishing, and there's no catching. Look at what it says in verse number 4. It says, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? So Jesus is on the shore. There's the length of about a football field between the boat and the shore. Daylight's breaking. They don't know it's him on the shore. And then Jesus yells out to them. He says, children. In Aramaic, it's the word paidia. And it's simply the plural word for small children. But it's a very distinct word. It blends the concepts of children who have an undeveloped understanding, who have the position of a servant, but also hold the affection of someone's own child. So this is a very true and fitting description of how Jesus felt about these people. So he yells out at them, and he says, children, do you have any fish? Actually, it's a statement in the form of a question. Literal rendering, he's saying, children, you don't have any fish, do you? And so they answered him no. In verse number 6, he says to them, then cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some. And so they did. They cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of the fish. And that disciple whom Jesus loved, therefore, said to Peter, it's the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. So as this scene is unfolding, finally, the Apostle John, he starts connecting the dots, and he says to Jesus, to Peter, it's Jesus. It's the Lord. And so Peter, who just the night before said, I'm out. I'm untrustworthy. I'm unusable. I'm inadequate. I'm unblessable. What I've done to Jesus is irreparable. And so I'm out. It really, in his heart of hearts, it really wasn't what he wanted. But he made that announcement and said, I'm out. But then, when he finds out that that's Jesus on the shore, his actions actually betray his decision and shows what's really in his heart. And he jumps off the boat into the water and starts swimming as fast as he can to be with Jesus. I mean, he leaves the fish behind, his friends behind, and he jumps in the water and he's swimming to Jesus. Look at what it says in verse number 9. And when they got out on land, I'm going to read this slowly because I want you to catch the setting. I want you to see the picture here. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you've just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now, none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. And this is now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. There's so much that we can learn that if we could just wring things out of this passage. But there's just one thing I want to focus our attention on, one takeaway that I want for the morning. If you'll look at that very last sentence, verse number 14, it says, this is now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples, that he was showing something of who he was and what he was like and how he deals with us. So what was Jesus revealing about himself? Well, let's take note of the setting here, okay? Look at the setting. It says that Jesus reveals himself by the Sea of Tiberias, also known as the Sea of Galilee. This is the same body of water that these guys, these same men, were fishing in 3 years earlier when Jesus first said, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. Same body of water. These guys were doing the same thing this night that they were doing 3 years ago on that night. And that evening 3 years ago was a fruitless fishing expedition as well until Jesus comes along and says, hey, throw the net on the other side. You'll be successful. And they were blown away. And he says, you'll have the same kind of success in ministry with me that you've just experienced by just obeying what I told you to do. So Jesus is actually taking them back to the origin of his relationship with them. He's taking them back to their calling, back to the beginning, back when they were ordinary, unschooled, average workaday guys that had no spiritual resume, almost no faith, had really nothing to offer him. And their simple obedience on that first night that netted them this record catch, he says, I want you to do that same thing with people, with the portion of my creation that I love the most. Another thing about the setting is that the fields that were adjacent, right, with the body of water and the shoreline that they were on right there, they were the same fields when just about a year ago, Jesus fed thousands of people with one little boy's lunch of fish and bread. And now here they are this night, and Jesus is about to feed them fish and bread. He's connecting their ministry with their current reality right now. What he wants them to do is he wants them to remember the high points. He wants them to remember the adventure, the faith, the miracles. He wants them to remember everything that they have done together, all the promises. He's taking them back to the very beginning of their journey with him, back to their calling. I think one of the things that Jesus is trying to teach them is, hey guys, do you remember when I first called you onto the team? When I first asked you to follow, you didn't have a spiritual resume. You didn't have a body of work that qualified you to be on my team, and I chose you anyway. And now here you are, and you feel disqualified. You're embarrassed by your activity, and I want you to know I still want you on the team. I'm asking from you the same thing I asked from you 3 years ago. All I asked you to do 3 years ago was follow me. Just follow me. And I'm asking the same thing today. Just follow me. Follow me when it's easy and follow me when it's hard. And follow me when you're successful and follow me when you're a failure. Follow me when you understand what I'm doing. Follow me when there's not any clarity. Follow me when there's ambiguity. Follow me when there's clarity. Just follow me when it's easy. Follow me when it's hard. Just follow me. And that's exactly the same thing that he asked of us. Just today. But you don't know what I did yesterday? Follow me today. Follow me today. I didn't ask you on the team because you were qualified. And I don't disqualify you because of your mess-ups and your failures. Another thing about the setting is look again at verse number 9. It says, when they got to the land, they saw a charcoal fire in place. Now, I think that the Holy Spirit through the Apostle John is absolutely brilliant. He doesn't mince around he doesn't miss any details. It doesn't say here that there was a charcoal fire in place. It said they saw. That means all of them saw. I think in particular, Peter saw this charcoal fire in place. You know, the last time that Peter saw a charcoal fire was the worst night of his life. Because it was in that night inside the courtyard of the high priests when Jesus was being questioned just hours before his execution. On that night, Peter stood close to a charcoal fire trying to warm his body and numb his conscience because he had just done what he promised he would never do. He denied that he even knew Jesus. And it crushed him. And he felt like that's something I can never recover from. That's something that I can never be reinstated after I've done this. I've blown it. I've messed up so badly, so often, that the damage between me and Jesus is irreparable. And he feels disqualified. So here he is now. He's staring at another charcoal fire, and all the memories come back, and all the guilt comes back, and all the shame comes back. And I want us to know this. This too is what grace looks like. This too is how God operates in our life. There are times when we're able to be reminded of that thing in our life that we wish wasn't true about us. That thing when we blew it so badly, we hurt somebody else so badly, we turned our back on God so badly. It's that relationship that we wish we'd never had, that spring break that we wish we could erase from our minds. It's that business deal that we knew we shouldn't have gotten into, but the payoff seemed to be too easy that we wish it just wasn't true. That thing that we said, that place that we went, that person that we hurt. And in God's grace, he allows us just for a moment to remember that and to once again maybe feel the shame, but not for long. Because then, as the book of Hebrews says, it's eyes back on Jesus, eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith. You get that? Do we understand who Jesus is? That he is the author, the initiator of our faith. You are not the author, the initiator of your faith. I'm not. He's the one that started the work in you, and he's the one that's going to bring that work to completion. Do you understand that? He is the author, the initiator, the completer of our faith. And so just for a moment, we sometimes are reminded of the truth about how badly we have messed up and the things that the enemy wants us to believe disqualify us, but then it's eyes back on Jesus and his grace. I don't think that we can really appreciate God's grace and we can really absorb the good news unless we're face to face with owning the bad news of our life and how messed up and how broken we really are. And then Jesus does something that I think is absolutely remarkable, incredible. Jesus actually invites Peter and the rest of the guys to contribute or to participate in what he's already doing, what he's got going on. He says to them, hey, I've got enough fish for us. I've got enough bread for us. It's all ready. I got breakfast all for us. But why don't you bring some of the fish that you've just caught? You know, some of the fish that I just helped you catch. Bring some of the stuff that you have. He's saying, let's do this together. Let's work together. Let's be in union with this. This is what grace looks like. Just come on. I believe this is what Jesus is actually revealing about himself. What I believe that Jesus is revealing about himself in John chapter 21 is this, that the Lord delights in accomplishing his ministry through us, not because he needs us, but just simply because he wants us. You get that? Not because he needs us, simply because he loves us and because he wants us. And I think this is a picture of real ministry. This is where heaven and earth meet. This is where God's divine help touches our human enablement. It's our inadequacies and his sufficiency. Our participation, but it's all his power. And there's a bunch of you in here. You know, you've walked with the Lord for so many times. You've face planted spiritually so many times. You've been in ministry so long, you know it's really him that's doing the work through you. We know that we can't take any credit for the good stuff God does in us and through us, that it's all, isn't that true? Because we're just the broken, incomplete, messed up, inadequate vessels that in his grace he chooses to use. Isn't that true? Frank and Carla, you're broken and you're a blessing. And we're a better church because of the way that God works through you. Barrett and Rochelle, you're inadequate and you're invited. And we're a better church because of the way that God works through you. It's true. Pat, Renee, you guys are incomplete and you're empowered. And we're a better church because of the way that God works through you. Like I said, I can name person after person after person after person. And it is true that we're broken, but it's also true that that's the likes of who he chooses to use. And it's so beautiful because none of us can take credit for the good stuff that God does in and through his body, in and through his church. You know, the fact that God doesn't need us, but he desires and delights in including us and doing his work through us, that should delight us. Can you imagine the strain that it would be if God said, this all-sufficient God that we love and serve, if he says, listen, I've taken this as far as I can, now it's up to you, it's all up to you, and kind of does that, we would crater. But instead, you know what he says? In the last chapter of the book of Matthew, the prelude to the Great Commission, he says, here's the truth. All power, all authority is given me in heaven and earth. And then he says, now, go do ministry. Go make disciples and baptize people and teach them to observe everything that I've taught you. And he says, you're not going to be by yourself in this. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So those of you that are D group leaders and you feel inadequate every time you show up for your D group meeting, keep attempting to make disciples, because you know what? He is with you always. And those of you that are trying to be small group leaders for middle school kids, God bless you, okay? And you feel inadequate and you wonder if anything's sinking in their head, keep on doing that, because he is with you always. And those of you parents that pray your brains out for your kids every night, and you try to initiate spiritual conversations around the dinner table, but you're fully aware that you're not the model that you want to be and you feel like you should be, you keep on doing that and attempting to make disciples in your kids' lives, because he is with you always. That our God delights in using us, not because he needs us, but simply because he wants us and he loves us. God does not call us because we're qualified. He qualifies us simply because he called us. Does that make sense? This is what grace looks like. You know, there's so much here where Jesus reveals himself Jesus reveals about himself to us. One of the things in this text where he reveals himself is he reveals that he's all-knowing. He knows everything. Remember, he said, children, you don't have any fish, do you? I knew that. I'm all-knowing. He's all-powerful. Hey, throw the net on the other side of the boat. Watch what happens. He says, I can pull that off. I can make that happen. I'm all-powerful. He's all-sufficient. They got up on the shore. He had breakfast ready. Didn't need their help at all. He's all-sufficient. But you know the greatest thing we learned from John chapter 21? Is that this God is all gracious. Hey, I don't need you, but why don't you come over here and bring some of your stuff? Let's cook this together. Let's fellowship. Let's eat together. He's let us know. Listen, he's saying, listen, disciples, listen, followers. I am heaven bent on redeeming everything you think has come between us, is what he's saying. You're still in. I still want you. I can still use you. And this is what grace looks like. Sometimes I ask myself the question, why did the Apostle John, why did he include chapter 21? Because it's not like he needed to. Did you pay attention last week when Glenn was preaching what the end of chapter 20 looked like? Listen, the end of chapter 20, it looks like it's a perfect fitting. He could have wrapped up the book right then. The end of chapter 20 says this, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And roll credits, and that's just going to be fine. That's all we need, right? But I'm so grateful that he included chapter 21. You know why? Because chapter 21 is all about grace. It's all about when we have come to the end of ourselves. And by the way, I don't think we're really very usable in eternal things and spiritual things until we come to the end of ourselves. And Jesus in his grace brings us there, to those points where we feel like we can never be used. And when you are at your lowest and you feel like you cannot be used, that's when you're finally ready to be used in the Master's hands. Because that's what grace looks like. You and I, we grow spiritually, not by making the right call all the time, but by responding appropriately when we make the wrong call. That's what grace looks like. And our appropriate response to our messed up lives and to our sinfulness is, oh God, we need your grace. See, when I look at the Apostle Peter's life, I just think of grace. It's so abundant, even though it's absolutely undeserved. And by the way, God's grace is always undeserved. To say that someone deserves grace it's a contradiction in terms. We can no more deserve God's grace than we can plan our own surprise party, right? I mean, we can desire God's grace, we can ask for God's grace, we can plead for God's grace, but the minute we think we deserve it, we think we deserve is no longer grace. It's something that we've earned. And grace, God's grace, cannot be earned. To earn something is to find an equivalent, like I've done this and so I deserve this, and none of us deserve God's grace. Grace is actually birthed from a hopeless inequity. It's the offer of exactly what we don't deserve. As a matter of fact, the only time that we can really receive God's grace is when we are convinced we don't deserve it. That's why the good news is not good news until we are face to face with the bad news of our own depravity, our own wretchedness, our own non-qualification. That's when we're candidates for salvation. That's when we're candidates for sanctification. That's when we are usable in the Master's hands. Just like all of the human grace trophies that are all throughout the scriptures. Listen, when you think about Abraham's faithlessness, when you think about Moses' anger and his disobedience, when you think about Rahab's promiscuous lifestyle, Jacob's jealousy and his deceitfulness, Gideon's doubt and his timidity, you think about Samson's ego and lewdness, and David's adultery, and Jonah's racism, and Peter's hypocrisy, and Thomas's doubt. Listen, all those people had labels that were unflattering, beyond embarrassing, even seemed disqualifying. And yet their labels were not an obstacle for God. And they're not an obstacle for you. That's what grace looks like.